All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book today, I'm going to go through how I became a conspiracy theorist. This might take a little bit, but it's going to be the abridged version of it. I might get into a deeper version of it later, especially since all the Epstein revelations have come out. And people are wondering who believes the stuff and who doesn't believe the stuff. At this point, honestly, I don't even know if I believe the stuff or not. Like I said in the previous video, like I really want to believe in it, and I'll show you how I came to becoming a conspiracy theorist in the first place. Now, first off, when I was in high school, I started reading conspiracy books that my friend let me borrow, which there was one on like the New World Order money supply, where it was like proving all the like fractional reserve banking and all that other stuff. I forget the title of the book though. It just had like a pyramid with the eye on the front. It had like green letters. Can't remember what it was called though. It was a long time ago. But of course, I also read Behold a Pale Horse by William Cooper, which, he believed in aliens and stuff, but most of the other stuff in the book about them wanting to destroy the family and the banking system and all that other stuff is pretty much right on point, right? And, he believed in aliens, but, he worked for the military for a long time. He was in the Navy, and, that's part of their psyop. When you get to the higher levels, it seems like a lot of people's like that Bob Lazar guy too. Whatever they're working on, and the technology on those higher levels, at least when people see it, they assume it's alien. Either that or he was just completely BSing. But it seems like, they are working on secret projects that are a much higher level of technology than the public is exposed to. And maybe they use the whole like aliens Area 51 thing as like a type of like cover story for that. And then even some of the higher level military people get tricked into the cover story. I don't know. All right. So the second major point, I know a lot of people go to, 9/11, but I clearly remember the original World Trade Center bombing for one specific reason. The suspect associated with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing from Maplewood, New Jersey is Ramizi Youssef, who was the mastermind behind the attack. He was later captured and convicted for his role in the bombing, which resulted in 6 deaths and over thousands of injuries. So this guy was living a few blocks away from my friend's house. It was like a 10-minute bike ride from my house where this guy was captured, where he was living, and he was the head guy who drove the van into the World Trade Center and blew it up. Right. So of course it was the big talk of the town. Everybody was talking about, oh, did you hear the guy that blew up the World Trade Center lived like a block away from me? Everybody was talking about it. Obviously we didn't have a lot of access to the internet back then, but we did have this. The FBI allowed the 1993 World Trade Center bombing to happen. A link to this article is in the description, by Ralph Blumenthal. Basically, the article's talking about how the FBI informant was supposed to basically give them a fake bomb, but then they used a real bomb. And it even says that this guy, the supposed FBI agent terrorist guy, actually called the FBI and said, hey man, you guys are giving them real stuff. And they said, don't worry about it. And then he calls them a couple times telling them, hey, they're really going to blow it up. And they're like, don't worry about it. So to say that the FBI was directly involved, it's kind of hard. But this guy was, an Egyptian military guy. Where is it saying that? basically the informant was an Egyptian military guy that, yeah, see, Mr. Salam, a 43-year-old former Egyptian army officer, was used by the government of the United States to penetrate a circle of Muslim extremists who are now charged in 2 bombing cases: the World Trade Center attack and the foiled plot to destroy the United Nations, the Hudson River tunnels, and other New York City landmarks. Now, that would have been messed up. If they got the Hudson Tunnel, that would have really screwed New York up. So we can see that that was a thing, and that people believed at the time that the FBI was in some way involved in the bombing of the World Trade Center the first time. That was even before 9/11, right? So me being already deep into conspiracy talk, all the stuff about, the FBI tapping your phone if you say certain keywords, that was like in the early 90s. Obviously reading all these conspiracy books and talking about conspiracy stuff with my friends. When this came up, we were just like blown away, especially with the guy being found in our town. Then, of course, you have actual 9/11. I remember watching this on PBS when it first came out, the Larry Silverstein poll video. I'm not even going to play it. Everybody's seen it. You can look it up. Just type in Larry Silverstein WTC pull it, and you'll get this video where Larry Silverstein admits to saying, let's just play it. Let's just play it. Let me check the sound real quick. All right. It's only 50 seconds.
World Trade Center 7 had always been considered the starting point for rebuilding. Located north of the slurry wall, 7 had been cleared faster than the rest of the site, and there had been no bodies to recover. Pelted by debris when the North Tower collapsed, 7 burned until late afternoon, allowing occupants to evacuate to safety.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
So obviously that kind of proves that the towers were able to be controlled or demolished in a controlled fashion, because obviously pull it is a construction term for, lighting the fuse when you're about to collapse a building, right? So that evidence right there was a lot of evidence that something was going on with, the World Trade Center, since they had already tried to attack it before. And then the second time was a much more sophisticated attack. But again, you start, once you saw the first one, you start questioning, well, if the government was involved in the first one, were they involved in this one? And then, of course, you got your movies like Loose Change and all that other stuff that started to come out. But, I didn't need to be convinced. I was convinced way back here in 1990, 95, 96, right? I was already convinced, right? Then after that, we already went over a Long Kiss Goodnight, but really, the Lone Gunman pilot series is a classic, and that's what really got me into starting to believe that there was more truth in the movies and in TV shows than there was on the news. That's when I really got into the movie analysis, TV analysis, and started believing myself that, this stuff was being put in movies and TV, predictive programming, whatever you want to call it. I know some people don't like that term, but I just don't know how else to refer to it. The first episode aired on March 4th, 2001. Now, if you know, March 4th is a military, esoteric military date, which is, because March is Mars, right? Represents Mars, and Mars is the god of war. So it's like a esoteric or occult um, date in which, you're supposed to be able to gain blessings from the god of war if you launch an attack on that day, right? So it was on March 4th, 2001. The title was Pilot. In the show, a computer hacker takes control of a Boeing 727 passenger plane and flies it towards the World Trade Center with the specific intention of crashing the plane into one of the Twin Towers. It's only at the very last moment that the lone gunmen are able to hack the hacker and avert disaster and death for those aboard the plane and those inside the World Trade Center. Now, because I was in college at the time, I did see live on TV the second plane hit the towers. And so, I know a lot of people say there was no planes. I'm kind of either it was the hijackers and they really did just fly the planes into the building, or this remote control takeover theory. I wouldn't discount this as a possibility. The no planes, I'm not really sold on that. I mean, maybe it could have been planes and directed energy weapons. I could kind of go for that. Or, they were obviously that they were pre-installed with explosives for demolition. I believe that could be a possibility too. I'm just, the no planes thing, it's kind of hard for me. Now, at the Pentagon, it's different because the way that it was flying in so low and the size of the hole, could have been a missile. No, if you ask me. Okay, so then what really started blowing my mind, right, was when I saw Stargate Atlantis, right? You can see here that they've got this like iPad type thing, right? That was in, these are all recreations of the one from the show, right? See, here's the one from the show, right? There's Dr. Weir, right? The female captain. No disrespect to her. She's actually pretty good. But as you can see here, but then when we find out when Stargate Atlantis came out, oh, whoops, I closed that one down. Stargate Atlantis, 2004 to 2009, right? And when did the iPad come out? The first iPad was released on April 3rd, 2010, and was unveiled January 27th, 2010. So, they got these in here 2004 to 2009, right? It's an iPad, right? And so probably the military was using something similar to this around that time period, because it makes sense. It's about 10 years before the actual iPad came out, right? So when I saw that, and then I was like, wait a minute, this was in Stargate when the iPad came out. I'm like, oh man, they put everything in the movies, everything in TV to get you used to it coming out before it comes out, right? And then you just accept it as completely normal because you've already kind of subliminally accepted it as the cool thing, because they put it next to like cool people and sexy people and put it in your favorite TV shows, because it's all about like generating that emotion, right? It's like the main thing you'll see in the propaganda in movies is like they always put the American flag at the like emotional peak of the movie, right? Like you could see that in that White House Down movie, where it's like the everything's building up to this emotional moment, and then the girl goes out and she waves the presidential flag like right at the last moment, and it's like you're about to like cry. You're like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And then she starts waving the American flag, and it's like they do that. They prime you to get into an emotional state, and then they present stuff to you in a certain way, right? That's just my theory, okay? It's just my theory. Could all be fake. you know, right? So then you can just get into analyzing any movie, right? Let me zoom out on this a little bit because I was like just thinking the other day about this, how the transhumanist agenda, right? And I was like, whoa, this movie is a masterpiece, not Short Circuit 2, but Short Circuit 1, right? Because think about it, right? They're kind of, first of all, it's genius because they distract you from the Indian immigrant with the robot, right? Because you're so amazed that this robot is like this humanoid robot that's was designed by DARPA is like getting its own personality and life and all that stuff that you completely forget about the Indian dude, right? Being like an immigrant and all this other stuff. You just take that as like, you know, par for the course, right? And you can see here, right? It's like the evolutionary type of thing where the Indian guy is the next stage in evolution, and then the humanoid robot is like the final form, right? And you might say, oh, this sounds crazy, right? But think about who the other guy is in the movie, right? Steve Gutenberg, right? And if you were around in the 80s and 90s, that was one of the factoids or discussion points that always accompanied this movie, the Short Circuit series, right? Was, oh, Steve Gutenberg was in it. Oh, yeah, Steve Gutenberg. Was he related to the guy that invented the printing press? And people are like, I don't know. Was he? I don't know. His name's Gutenberg, right? And think about the significance of that, right? Because AI and robotics is kind of like the new printing press. Like it's the because like the amount of human advancement that was allowed by the printing press and when all the majority of humans were able to get access to the Bible and become literate, like that completely changed society and history forever, right? And so AI and robotics is a very similar type of step in humanity. It's going to change humanity forever. We're never going back to the world before AI. Just like when Gutenberg invented the printing press, we're never going back to the world before the printing press, right? And then the fact is that you don't even question that, Steve Gutenberg is surpassed by the Indian guy because the Indian guy is the guy that can program Johnny Five, and then Johnny Five is going to surpass the Indian guy and Steve Gutenberg. And then what happens in the second movie, right? He gets plated in gold and then he becomes an American citizen, right? At the end of Short Circuit 2, Johnny Five becomes an American citizen, right? And it's all like subliminal. Like if you're younger, this won't make any sense to you, but you can kind of understand how your parents and grandparents were subliminally coaxed into allowing this stuff to happen because it was just a cool movie with a cool Indian guy, a quirky Indian guy, and a cool robot, right? And you don't even notice the transhumanist agenda in there. First, you get replaced by an Indian guy, then you get replaced by a robot, right? I'm laughing, but it's not funny. Okay, so the last movie we're going to talk about here is Dragnet. Dragnet, the movie, right? See, they've got the pagan thing here. Now, a lot of people wonder how come there's never been a Bohemian Grove movie. Well, this is it. This is the Bohemian Grove movie, right? People against goodness and normality, pagan. Yeah, it's the pagans that are like that, I'm sure. It's not any other tribe. Of course not. Only the pagans, the white pagan guys, they're the ones that are into super high level evil. Yes, I understand. Right? And again, the inversion in the movie where the virgin is a woman and the bad guys are white. Okay. And you got the chick from Baywatch in there. She's supposed to be a virgin. They got the satanic imagery, of course. And, we got these guys. But it's the Bohemian Grove movie, right? Because what happens, right? It's like the bad guy is like the main preacher of like an evangelical church in California. And he's also the head priest at Bohemian Grove, right? And Bohemian Grove, it's like basically that's what it is, right? It's like they go to this huge party, everyone's doing drugs and like doing a bunch of crazy stuff, right? They're all dressed like weird and like freaks and stuff. And then they go in, bust it. They're sacrificing a virgin, right? Just like the cremation of care ritual at Bohemian Grove. And they're pagans, right? Like what are they called? Bohemians, right? They worship, you know, semi-satanic type of Moloch gods and all that stuff, right? So there is a Bohemian Grove movie. It's just not covered very much in the conspiracy world. So yeah, that is how I got into being a conspiracy theorist. We'll get into the book now. All right. The New Era, 1957 to 1964, page 1102. Kind of like the second paragraph, but it's like right at the top. This pressure became worse on East Germany just after 1959, when the attractions of West Germany became greater, and the endless demands on Soviet resources from missile, space speculators, improved standards of living, and disintegrating agricultural systems were increasing. To fulfill these demands, East Germany scrapped its unfinished second five-year plan. Oh, I already read that part, so I guess we're on page 103, the second paragraph. Yeah. Okay. In contrast with this, the West German economic miracle that made that country the third largest importer and the second largest exporter in the world, with freedom and prosperity, was more than Khrushchev could stand. West Berlin, which shared in the freedom and prosperity of the West, in spite of the fact that it was surrounded by the grim penury of East Germany, and was more objectionable to Khrushchev because it was a glaring exhibition of the success of the West and the failure of the East. As Khrushchev himself said, West Berlin was a bone stuck in my throat. There can be little doubt that Khrushchev's talk about peaceful coexistence and the inevitable triumph of socialism by competition without war was sincere. He was convinced that the Soviet Union, as the sole earthly representative of a communist regime, must be preserved at any cost. He, with his associates, since the testing of the first successful Soviet thermonuclear explosion in August 1953, have recognized that a thermonuclear war could destroy all civilized beings, including the victors. The Red Army at times, and Red China always, objected to this with the argument that enough would survive to permit reconstruction of a socialist way of life, but Khrushchev was not persuaded. On this basis, he sincerely wished to divert the communist capitalist struggle into a non-violent area. Thus, he was sincere in his disarmament suggestions and negotiations, but since he distrusted the Western powers just as thoroughly as they distrusted him, any advance along the road to disarmament was almost hopeless. The Soviet position sought limitation on nuclear arms and long-range vehicles, and was much less willing to accept limits on conventional arms or ground forces. This is equivalent to saying that he wished to limit the United States and was reluctant to limit the Soviet Union. Only after 1959, with increased strain on the Soviet Union's economic manpower, was there any readiness to curtail infantry forces. At the same time, The almost insane secrecy of the Russian system made the Kremlin reluctant to accept any effective kind of inspections of disarmament, which was almost automatically regarded by them as espionage. The United States was even less eager than the Kremlin to reach any effective disarmament agreement since, unlike the Soviet Union, most of the pressures from American economic and business circles were in favor of the continuation of large defense spending, the source of a major segment of America's employment opportunities and industrial profits. Only at the beginning of 1964, when President Johnson astutely sought to combine reduced military expenditures with reduced taxes and a large consumers' markets, did it become possible to dissipate some of the opposition to reduced arms expenditures from the military industrial complex. Accordingly, the Soviet disarmament proposal of April 30th, 1957 were discussed month after month and year after year with minimal progress. By 1959, it was quite clear that the Kremlin's chief aim was to prevent Germany and Red China from getting nuclear weapons. Accordingly, they concentrated on efforts to direct the disarmament discussions towards restrictions on nuclear testing and on nuclear-free zones in Central Europe and in Asia. The nuclear-free zone in Central Europe, which fitted in well with a British-favored policy of disengagement in that area, was known as the Repacki Plan, after its nominal proponent, but reappeared in various versions for many years. There can be little doubt that a central role in Soviet foreign policy was played by the Kremlin, not unjustified fear of Germany and its almost neurotic opposition to a unification of Germany that was not under Soviet control, or to the acquisition by West Germany of nuclear weapons. A stalemate on this subject was ensured by America's refusal to accept the status quo of a divided Germany because our devotion to the Adenauer regime and our fear that West Germany, rebuffed by us on the issue of reunification, might prefer reunity to prosperity or democracy and make a deal with the Soviet Union to achieve such unity. This we could not accept because our conviction that German infantry forces were necessary to the Western European defense system if there was to be any hope of defending Europe against Soviet ground forces on any level of combat below all-out thermonuclear warfare. For these reasons, the United States committed itself repeatedly to the Adenauer regime to work for the unification of Germany on democratic lines. Moreover, in 1957, an Eisenhower commitment to Adenauer subsequently expanded into a formal declaration of Berlin by the three Western powers, July 29, 1957, stated that any comprehensive disarmament agreement with the Soviet Union must necessarily presuppose a prior solution of the problem of German reunification. A bitter series of disappointments during the 4 years 1958 to 1962 led the Kremlin to the desperate decision to move part of its IRBMs to Cuba. Three factors may have played significant roles in this reckless decision. In the first place, the inability of the Soviet Union in 1961 to overtake the American lead in ICBMs made it seem necessary for the Kremlin to seek to remedy some of its deficiency in these long-range weapons by deployment closer to the United States of some of its larger supply of IRBMs. Moreover, increasing evidence that the Soviet Union could not compete successfully with the United States in such nonviolent areas as agricultural production, raising standards of living, or aid and technical assistance to neutral nations made it seem necessary that the Soviet Union seek some method of increasing its military and political pressure on the United States that would, at the same time, give a boost to its prestige throughout the world among neutral or sympathetic states. Finally, the growing recognition that the Soviet chances were dwindling for reaching the kind of settlement it wanted with West Germany or West Berlin undoubtedly led many in the Kremlin to conclude that a successful emplacement of Soviet missiles in Cuba, even if there were no real intentions of using them, could lead to a compromise settlement under which these missiles would be removed from Cuba in return for a Berlin settlement more favorable to the Soviet desires. Whatever the reason for the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba, once begun in August 1962, it proceeded with amazing speed. The White House was suspicious by the beginning of September, and on the 24th of that month, President Kennedy obtained from the Congress permission to call up 150,000 reservists, but aerial photography did not show missile placements until October 15th. Soviet high-altitude AA rockets, SA-2s, had been identified in Cuba in August and Elysian 28 jet bombers in September. The week of October 14th to 21st was one of steadily increasing crisis within the United States government, although no public announcement was made before the president's speech of Monday, October 22, 1962. This speech established a quarantine on all offensive equipment under shipment to Cuba, demanded dismantling of the missile sites, and withdrawal of Soviet forces under threat of stronger action by the United States, and announced that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation shall be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring full retaliation. The effects of this speech were explosive. To the world, it began 6 days of crisis in which the two superpowers hung on the brink of nuclear war. In reality, the situation was quite different. The crisis, in fact, was an almost perfect example of diplomatic crisis and how such a crisis should be handled. The pattern for a classic diplomatic crisis has 3 stages: 1. Confrontation, 2. Recognition, and 3. Settlement. The confrontation consists of a dispute, that is, a power challenge in some area of conflict. Stage 2 is recognition by both sides of the realities of the power relationship between them, always much easier when only 2 states are involved. And 3 is a yielding by the weaker of the two, accompanied by an effort by the stronger to cover that retreat by refusing to inflict a humiliation or obvious triumph over the weaker. As Metternich said, a diplomat is a man who never allows himself the pleasure of a triumph, and does so simply because it is to the interest of the stronger that an opponent who recognizes the victor's strength and is reasonable in yielding to it not be overthrown or replaced by another ruler who is too ignorant or too unreasonable to do so. The crisis of October 1962 was conducted along these lines in a masterly fashion by President Kennedy, except for a few minor blemishes caused by some of his subordinates. The power situation throughout the missile crisis was overwhelmingly in favor of the United States by at least a 4-to-1 ratio. The Kremlin could do nothing to defend Cuba if we attacked it, since its missiles and jet bombers there were not ready. Moreover, the Kremlin could expect devastation of the Soviet Union itself if it pushed the Cuban project. It was a mark of Kennedy's masterful analysis here that he ignored Cuba and made the crisis a simple USSR USA confrontation. In doing so, he placed the issue on a pure power basis and made rubbish of the clutter of unrealities accumulated on the American foreign policy since 1945. NATO, our allies elsewhere, the United Nations, and the Organization of American States were not consulted before decision and action. They were informed afterward, chiefly on October 23rd. When informed and asked to back the White House, they could neither decide nor act. The dominant fact in the whole situation was the overwhelming character of America's power and the fact that this was known both to the White House and to the Kremlin, but was largely unknown and certainly unpublicized to the world. Around the Soviet Union's border were 144 Polaris, 103 Atlas, 159 Thor, Jupiter, and Titan missiles, 1,600 long range bombers, many of them constantly in the air with nuclear bombs. When the president's speech began the public crisis, 5 divisions of the United States Army Strategic Reserves, totaling about 100,000 men, plus 100,000 Air Force, and an equal number of Navy and Marine personnel, had been mobilized or alerted. The 1st Armored Division had been flown from Texas to the East Coast. 90 naval vessels, including 8 carriers, were on patrol to blockade. A Cuban invasion command had been assembled in Florida, and 2,700 relatives of military personnel had been evacuated from Guantanamo. Under such pressure, Khrushchev wilted. It might almost be said that he panicked. On Friday, October 26th. Only 8 days before, on October 18th, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko had made a personal visit to the White House and, without mentioning the Soviet activities in Cuba, had threatened Mr. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was unable to postpone any longer the conclusion of a peace treaty with the East German Democratic Republic, yielding to it control over the access routes to Berlin. The president had listened and dismissed the foreign minister without saying anything about the missile buildup in Cuba, which was already under discussion within his government. But a week later, the world could think of nothing else except the missile buildup and the American response. As Washington waited for the Kremlin's reaction to the president's speech, work on the missile sites continued. Soviet vessels were approaching the American naval patrol around Cuba, and the American government was approaching its allies, the UN and the OAS. Before the public crisis began on Monday, the administration recognized that its blockade was illegal, that the United States itself had once fought a war for free navigation of the seas, and that we recognized blockade only in connection with a declared war. As a concession to this, the American action was called a quarantine, not a blockade. The chief point of concern was, would the Soviet accept it or would their vessels precipitate war by trying to break through? The test came on Thursday, October 25th, at the end of 3 days of confused activity in other corners of the stage. On Tuesday, October 23rd, as the United States took its case to the UN and the OAS, reactions came from its allies and world opinion. Both reactions were adverse, but most states made it clear that they would not oppose the American action. Although the British government, like the rest of our allies, supported the American action, public opinion in England, including The Guardian, The Times, and the leaders of the Labour Party, flung back at us the criticism the Eisenhower administration had made of the British attack on the Suez 6 years earlier, ignoring the United Nations, deceiving and bypassing one's allies, resorting to violent rather than peaceful procedures in international disputes, and risking nuclear war before negotiations had been exhausted. Pakistan and India, unable to agree on anything else, were united in their criticism of Kennedy's irresponsible exposure of the world to the risk of war. Sweden flatly rejected the blockade. In these same days, the 20 other Latin American states voted to support the American blockade of Cuba, and Argentina offered to provide ships to participate in it, but several states indicated that they would not support an American invasion of Cuba if the blockade failed to enforce removal of the missiles. The United Nations, as might be expected, was not so successful in reaching any agreement. 3 solutions were introduced, submitted by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the 40 neutrals out of 105 member states, but it was impossible to obtain the necessary 2/3 vote for any one of them, and none came to a vote. In the meantime, for 2 days, the important questions hung unanswered. What would the Soviet ships do when they reached the blockade? The first, a tanker, was challenged by an American destroyer on Thursday, was acknowledged, and gave the necessary information that it was carrying no arms to Cuba. Within a few hours, it became clear that 12 of 25 ships en route to Cuba were turning back. The Kremlin had backed down. The following night, Friday, October 26, 1962, the White House received a long and confused letter from Khrushchev. Its tone clearly showed his personal panic, and to save his reputation, it was not released to the public. The next morning, the Soviet Foreign Office published a quite different text, suggesting that a deal be made dismantling both the American missile sites in Turkey and the Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Oops. To those inside both governments, this was recognized as a Soviet surrender, since they knew that the Turkish sites were obsolete and were already scheduled to be dismantled within a few months. Although this would have amounted to giving something for nothing on the Russian side, it was rejected by the White House because it would have represented to the world a surrender of Turkey, our ally on the Soviet border, because the Kremlin had succeeded in establishing a direct threat on our border. Instead, the White House replied to Khrushchev's unpublished first note, extracting from it an offer to remove the Russian missiles if he would lift the blockade and promise not to invade Cuba. This acceptance was sent off to Moscow on Saturday night, while our mobilization for an attack on the Soviet missile sites, if their construction continued, went on. On Sunday morning, by radio from Moscow, Khrushchev's acceptance was announced. The work on the missile sites was ordered stopped, and they would be dismantled, with UN observation to verify the fact. In return, the president would promise not to attack Cuba or allow our allies to do so. This led directly to the removal and deportation of the missiles and Ilyushin bombers over the next few weeks. The Soviet soldiers and technicians left much more slowly and never completely. Inspection of the sites was prevented by Castro, who was wild with anger at the way he had been brushed aside and finally sold out by the Kremlin. As a result of this failure, the American promise not to invade Cuba was also not given. The missile crisis, by stripping the Soviet-American rivalry down to its essential feature as a crude power rivalry, cleared up a number of ambiguities and opened a new era in the 20th century history. It showed 1. That the power balance between the two superpowers was clearly in America's favor, 2. That the United States government, in spite of Khrushchev's doubts, had the willpower to face and begin atomic war if necessary, 3. That no one really wanted thermonuclear war, and that Khrushchev was prepared to go to any reasonable point to avoid it, and 4. That deterrence actually does deter, and accordingly, that a modus vivendi might ultimately be achieved between the two superpowers. All right, I'm just going to stop reading there. The next chapter is the disintegrating super blocks, which is going to be on page 1109. If you want to read ahead, link is in the description. Now, there's not too much there. I think most people heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis in history class. It seems to be the standard kind of thing that everybody learns about when they learn about nuclear war. You know, they moved the missiles to Cuba. Probably wasn't a good idea, but you can see it did give them some leverage in order to make a negotiation for Cuba to remain communist right on our doorsteps, which I'm sure we would have preferred them to be capitalist because they're right next to us and people can literally swim from Cuba to Florida. So Russia did pull that off, but beyond that, I don't really see too much in this chapter that needs to be expanded upon. So I'll just leave it there for today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.